well. And then, hey, it's a big topic, don't you think? So, and also just, Tom, I moved quickly on item number 3 because there were a room full of people here, and I didn't allow staff to even say what it was because it was uncontested. Is there anything wrong with that other than me being impolite and needing to apologize to the staff who were here? Because we can go back to it. I was just trying to move quickly since it was uncontested, and I realized maybe I was going too fast.
No, that's the usual process. Staff show up just in case someone decides to contest, but no, they're not expected to. They're not expecting to speak.
Okay, well then I apologize for not even mentioning it, and thank them for their excellent work leading to an uncontested item. Okay, just wanted to make sure. All right, I'm going to take these in the order in which they were received, since we don't have long. I think we'll limit. Some have asked for a little more, but I think the longest is 10 minutes. And if someone asks for 15, I'm going to give you 10, just to keep moving, because we do have other people there, and generally anything you can say in 15 minutes, you should be able to say in 10. And it's really great if you have 10 minutes and you can say it in 5. Now, if you have something in 5, it's kind of hard to say it in 3. Funny thing, probably a law of physics or something, but do your best to make your point in this ongoing conversation. So first I have David Guy. And David, I can't read your handwriting. And group of attorneys and
yes.
managers?
Yes.
I thought it said mayors at first.
Mayors,
and I thought,
yes, mayors.
why is he bringing a bunch of mayors? Are we going to
You're not
talk
the
about
first
the
person that
municipal
can't read your
stormwater
handwriting.
permit too? Yeah, okay.
By prescriptions.
Great. Take it away. You've got 5.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Marcus, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Let me just real quick introduce some folks that are here today, because it really is in the Sacramento Valley, of course, as you know, a large team effort. We have 4 of the general managers here today that are actively working in this area. That includes Thad Bettner from Glen Colusa Irrigation District, Lewis Bear from Reclamation District 108, Ted Trimble from Western Canal Water District, and John Woodling with the Regional Water Authority are all actively involved in this and here. Also, council, of course, representing the region. That includes Andy Hitchings, Ryan Becerra, Alan Lilly, David Stephenson, David Elodjum are here as well. So anyway, I think it just shows the fact that these folks are here. We're committed to getting this done, and we're getting it done in the right way. First, just want to thank you for the workshops last fall. I think they were a very successful process, and I think, as Ms. Adamo mentioned, to me the discussion itself that Brock facilitated was very rich, very good. I've been around this for a lot of years, like a lot of you. I heard a lot of new creative thinking, and I think that was really good. But in some ways, I think the more important part of the workshops was the conversations that were going on in the back of the room and the side, with people saying, wow, you know, if you're thinking that, how about this? And some of the collaboration that has kind of emerged out of that. So I laud you for that. I want to make 4 quick points, if I could. We submitted yesterday a written a letter that articulates this, but let me just summarize those first. The first point is this concept of expert panels, or what I think earlier was called as a focused synthesis. We believe that's absolutely a great approach. And is going to take a little bit of time and a little bit of energy and a little bit of money, but I think is going to be really important, particularly, I think, recognizing a lot of the disagreements surrounding the pelagic fish issues is the way I would almost characterize, I think, what Brock summarized quite well. And anyway, we think that is absolutely a good process. I would just add one thought to the list of 4, I believe, that Peter and Sam advanced. It feels to us like there was a little bit of a, what about the upstream issues? There's obviously upstream habitat issues that are just critical to this. That includes cold water pool for salmon, the habitat along the river for birds as well, all of those kinds of things. So I think we ought to think about that. The second recommendation that we have is we believe it's a time for action. We want to move forward. We have suggested that. We believe that there are some things that you can do in your program of implementation fairly quickly within the next year. We think your June 2014 2014 marker that's been out there in various forums is a good one, and we have suggested in this that you invite folks to come back by June of this year with some of their ideas on what some of these projects are. And again, that is going to be both flow and non-flow related proposals. I think you will say Dave Vogel, obviously on our behalf, submitted I think some very interesting recommendations on that he is fleshing out, and we would love to advance. One just kind of little anecdote that I think is helpful in this regard is just to think in the next couple of days there is a proposed release of salmon brood from the Coleman Fish Hatchery that's been scheduled. And that is really unfortunate because, as many of you remember, last week there was a storm, and this storm was pretty well known was coming. And it's unfortunate in our view, for example, that these fish were not released with that storm. We had a natural pulse flow, we had natural turbidity, all the things that would be good for fish, and yet this is the kind of thing, again, that I think is a real coordinated effort that would really be beneficial to putting more fish in the river, getting fish out of the system, all the things that I think are important to all of us. The third recommendation along this line is kind of how do we, how do you utilize, I guess, some of your authorities to help with some of your sister agencies. We think that Water Code 13247 has been an underutilized tool in the Water Code. We think that you have a lot more abilities through that provision than has been exercised in the past, and I think you can bring a lot of these state agencies to deal with some of these issues in a quicker, more effective manner. And if there's a reason that they're not doing it, then they have an opportunity to come explain that to you and others. And then the fourth point, this probably goes without saying, but obviously BDCP is taking up a lot of oxygen in the water debate in California right now. The sequencing with your process and BDCP is obviously a question on a lot of people's minds, and I think a lot of folks are struggling through how are these processes going to work. Bottom line is tremendous investment in both capital, human and financial capital in BDCP. To me, the fruits of that process should be available to this board, and the parts of at least that are salient to your purview should be very much in front of you here over the next year, and how do we integrate into that process. So I'm going to leave that with that. I will just say that we've been working very closely with a variety of groups across the state in looking at some of these proposals. Jay Ziegler is going to make, I know, some comments, and others that are going to hopefully build on some of this, and we're looking forward to working with all these folks, again, to come back with you, some serious proposals for you here over the next some months.
Sure, Tam.
Thank you, David. I just want to get something clear in my mind. I read it in the letter. Thanks very much for sending it. These on-the-ground projects that you're putting together, you're proposing that it be considered for inclusion in the program of implementation for the update to the Water Quality Control Plan in Phase 2.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, we just think it's a time for action, and there's a lot of those activities. If you go back, I encourage, if you haven't, go back and look at your 2006 program of implementation. A lot of good stuff that I think Dr. Goodwin was just referring to that could be implemented. Let's get on with that. We have some things that we also want to bring that are supplemental to, that modify some of that we think will put more fish in the river and will help with the public trust resources.
Right. Other questions? Thank you for focusing on what we can do in the short term. We'll obviously.
Well, thank you for thinking about this and including us in that process.
That's great. Thank you very much. We'll obviously also be talking about long term as we go through multiple iterations, but appreciate the focus on the short term as well. Jay Ziegler, Nature Conservancy, 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, members of the board, good morning. I want to join in David's remarks, thanking you for undertaking this proceeding and the workshops, which we do believe also were very helpful in framing a number of the issues for consideration of the board. In particular, TNC did participate in more on the technical side in sharing information on the development of an ecological flow tool for the Sacramento River. That tool looks at a range of indicator species across different habitat types, floodplain, riparian, aquatic dependent species, and then overlays both the natural flow dynamic conditions as well as managed flows over time, and how those contingent species are affected by different flow regimes. And so we hope that that is an informative tool as the board's process goes forward. As David alluded to, we are excited to join in the work of other NGOs. We see this in many ways as an extension of the Nature Conservancy's 25 years of work along the Sacramento River. We plan to incorporate work that other NGOs have engaged with and with other agencies over time, including NHI, American Rivers. And as David also noted, we'll look at both flow-related habitat projects as well as non-flow-related projects as part of this, including kind of a range of different types of projects looking at groundwater management, sustainable conjunctive use projects, habitat restoration, including various wetland types, and coordinated releases, and the impacts, potential benefits for fisheries in the near term. So in sum, I want to thank the board again for undertaking this proceeding. We do believe that you have sufficient information to move forward in phase 2, and we hope that our work in a collaborative fashion in the watershed does continue to inform the board process, and we look forward to working with you.
That's great.
Thanks.
Do you have, are you putting any emphasis on fish passage? It was one of the items that David mentioned, the upstream activities.
Yeah, there are a number of projects that the Conservancy's been involved in, and Battle Creek, Butte Creek, that we certainly hope to continue to kind of have a lens on in this process, because so we do look at this as a holistic process, so yes.
Have you ever done a presentation at the board in any kind of format talking about some of the work you've been doing over the past couple of decades, like all of them?
You know, I don't think we've actually presented in the sense of providing an overview of our work, as our technical presentation really focused on the development of the ecological flow tool, and we have had some dialogue also with the Independent Science Bureau. We have a follow-on product to that we're still in the beta phase, looking at actual delta habitat contingent species. So there's kind of a tandem of analytical tools for adaptive management that we think would be very useful and interesting to the board.
Right. Well, we may ask you back to a report on that, if you don't mind. That would be great.
All right.
Other questions for now? All right, thanks
Great.
very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming and all the good work. Next, we have Richard Roos Collins for American Rivers.
Chair Marcus, Vice Chair Spivey Weber, members, Richard Roos Collins appearing on behalf of American Rivers. Let me make 3 introductory points before I get to the point. First, thanks to the board and your staff, Dr. Bernstein and ICF, for the workshops and the summary report. In our opinion, this process has created some progress from combat science in the direction of what I call competitive science, where uncertainty means we have competing hypotheses, and we use those hypotheses to guide our adaptive management. Second, Ms. Diadamo, you asked about processes that relate to this one. Valerie Kincaid and other participants in the San Joaquin Tributary Settlement Group have produced what I call a regulatory map that shows all pending processes that affect the facilities subject to Phase 1, and I will make sure that we submit that for the record. Something like that could be useful for Phase 2 as well. It's by year, by month, and by facility, so you can't miss what's happening.
Great.
And lastly, American Rivers is cooperating with NACWA and also the Nature Conservancy and many of NACWA's members in projects that we do believe belong in the program of implementation, and we look forward to reporting those projects at the appropriate time. So the question for this workshop is where we go from here. I'm going to ask one more specific question from the summary report. This appears on page 14. How can the current management / regulatory / science system be modified to promote effective adaptive management? This board must answer that question in the course of this update. And so let me offer you at least how I think about that question. First, you must adopt a program of implementation which is sufficient to achieve your objectives. The Roby and Bracconelli cases alike require that the program is sufficient, not aspirational, sufficient. And then the Port of Cologne Act more specifically requires, and here I'm referring to Water Code Section 12, well, I don't remember the exact citation, but it ends with 4.4.
That's very reassuring.
Requires specificity in the program of implementation. It requires that the program include all actions necessary to achieve a given objective. So all actions necessary to achieve the objective. It then requires a time schedule for performance, and it requires what was called surveillance when the Port of Cologne Act was adopted, what we might call monitoring for the purpose of adaptive management. In plain English, it requires who, what, when, where. Now, I'm going to offer into the record an excerpt from your 2006 Water Quality Control Plan, specifically pages 30 through 40. And if I may have this brought up to the board members.
Thank you.
In the meantime, what page of the report were you referring to on adaptive management? I didn't catch that.
Page 14.
14, thanks.
Thanks, Courtney.
So you now have before you an excerpt from the 2006 Water Quality Control Plan, and specifically an excerpt from the program of implementation that relates to the narrative objective for salmon protection. Again, pages 30 through 40. With respect, this program, like the prior programs in prior plans dating back to 1978, does not specify who, what, when, where in a form that results in accountability. It simply does not. It often lists agency X, but when it does, it then says agency X in cooperation with agencies Y and Z. It doesn't include a schedule. Essentially what it says is that agencies should continue to do the good things that they are doing. And of course we agree with that. But that doesn't result in accountability. And so we have one point on this question from page 14 of your summary report, which is that you should amend or replace the program of implementation in the 2006 Water Quality Control Plan to establish accountability for performance of all actions. Now, with respect to the flow measures, Roby teaches us that you can adjust water rights only through subsequent adjudicatory proceedings. So let's leave them aside as a hard case. Let's focus for the moment on non-flow actions. I believe, under the section that Jay cited and David cited, and again, I can't remember the citation, it ends with 4.7, that you do indeed have authority to require other agencies to perform unless they determine that the specific obligation stated in the program is inconsistent with their authorities. And by the way, while my memory has apparently failed this morning, we did submit extensive comments on phase 1 that include the citations in this entire discussion.
It's 13247.
Thank you so much, Ms. Diatama.
I didn't know it, but it was in David's letter.
So let me give an example of how this could work. And this example comes from an agency which is, by and large, not considered a friend of the State Water Board. But in this instance, it has a procedure that I think could be very helpful to you. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Back in 2001, the then chairman of FERC, Pat Wood, decided that it was contrary to the public interest that licensing proceedings were taking 10, 15, 20 years or longer. Now, the Federal Power Act didn't establish a specific deadline, but it plainly conveyed the principle that time was of the essence in making these licensing decisions to protect public resources. And yet, licensing proceedings were dragging on, some as long as 27 years, when he began this particular procedure. It was an annual workshop, an oversight workshop, where each licensee, with a delayed decision, the project manager within the Office of Energy Projects, other federal and state agencies, and stakeholders were required to show up before the chairman, indeed before the full commission, and explain why they had not completed the public business on time. That procedure was in effect for only a few years, and the backlog was gone. Now, whether FERC makes good decisions or not is not the topic of today's discussion. The point is, without new law or rule or policy, the chairman simply required agencies and stakeholders to show up and explain why they hadn't done specifically what they had promised or what they should be expected to do. And that expectation changed the way that the stakeholders viewed time. Time became important. So, as we suggested in the letter that we submitted on phase 1, we believe your program of implementation should ultimately appear in the form of a table that shows a specific who, which agency or stakeholder is responsible for what, when they will do it, and where. And if they do not perform, they should be expected to come before you and explain why not. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that I believe this section of the Water Code, as well as other authorities under other state and federal laws, could permit judicial review of inaction or untimely action of these agencies, same as the State Water Board, if you state obligations in the program of implementation with that specificity. So in conclusion, time is of the essence for you to complete this update, and respectfully, we request that you do something you have not done before in prior plans, which is to establish accountability for performance in the program of implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I have David Alajim. If needed, no, not needed. It's all been said. Great, thanks. And then next I have Gary Bobker from the Bay Institute for 10 minutes, and then John Rubin with the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, members of the board, Ms. Diadamo, my congratulations on your appointment and my sympathies on your appointment. My name is Gary Bobker. I'm the program director at the Bay Institute. In thinking about what is helpful for next steps as you go into the next part of phase 2, I think it's important to remember that probably the most successful invasive species in this system is the red herring. The point of that lame attempt at humor is that there are disagreements about issues and there are uncertainties, and they are not the same thing. I think Brock in the summary report attempted to make that distinction. I'm not sure it's always as clear as it might be, but that's a tough call, and I don't fault Brock or ICF for, for maybe not being as clear as I'd like in distinguishing between the two. But I think it's important to do that because there's a lot more disagreement than there is uncertainty on a lot of the key issues before you. The fact is that many, many parties dispute the role of flow, the importance of flow in relationship to other factors, but there's pretty overwhelming agreement in the scientific community about the primary role of flow as a driver of ecological conditions in the Bay Delta estuary. And in fact, I would suggest that based on the scientific record before you, the record that existed before the Phase 2 workshops and that was added to in the Phase 2 workshops, you actually have sufficient information to develop and adopt water quality standards in Phase 2 right now, even though, of course, you will go through the process of soliciting and evaluating further information. But I really think you've got enough now. So the point of harping on that distinction between disagreements and uncertainties is that you don't have a lot of time and you don't have a lot of resources. And even other folks, the science program doesn't have infinite resources too. So you got to be pretty focused about what you encourage them to put their time into and what you encourage the staff to drill down on. We've developed, and I apologize for not having it by April 2nd, but we were frankly a little exhausted after our March 29th Phase 1 submittal. My staff developed 2 tables here. The first table is a summary of the main arguments that are made by a lot of parties in the Bay Delta proceedings about flow. I mean, basically that are arguing that flow is not the primary driver, or there are these other factors that are more important than flow. And I'm not going to dwell on this. This is more of a cheat sheet. This really summarizes what we saw as the main arguments and the overwhelming scientific record that refutes those arguments. The importance of this, other than as a cheat sheet for you, Ms. Diadamo, is that you shouldn't really be encouraging a lot of work to get into the nuances and weeds of revisiting assertions that flow abundance correlations are based on bad data sets, or the relationships between flow and viability or flow and ecological function are weak, or that restoring habitat or addressing some other set of factors is more important and should substitute for actions on flow, or that there's been a change in conditions, the phrase often used being the regime shift, which means that devoting actions to manipulating flows aren't effective anymore. I really think those have been refuted, and to kind of to reinvent that wheel again would really be a waste of your time. But there are some really important questions that you can address in the time that you have, or that you can encourage others to address. And what I would suggest is that rather than revisiting the wheel about what we know, and what we know is that flow is a primary ecological driver. We know that there is a strong relationship between flow and the abundance, distribution, growth, productivity of a number of species and ecological functions. Rather than focus on that, let's focus on some issues about the interaction between flow and invasives, and the interaction between flow and physical habitat restoration. I focus on those two because those are 2 big topics in terms of long-term changes to the Bay Delta and in terms of management actions that are proposed in the Bay Delta. So what we would suggest, and this is summarized in Table 2, and Table 2 is not meant to be exhaustive. Table 2 is just sort of some ideas we came up with. And they track a little bit what you heard from Peter and Sam earlier. The first is that, okay, we know there's this strong relationship between flow and native species. We think that there's probably pretty good relationship between flow, salinity, and other factors and invasive species. But we haven't drilled down nearly as deeply on those relationships as we have on the flow native species relationships. So one of the things that could be useful over the next year, 2 years, et cetera, is to encourage parties to develop information about the tolerances of invasive species, targeted invasive species that we're particularly concerned about, and how manipulating salinity, manipulating flow, manipulating other water quality parameters that are within your regulatory authority might affect the abundance and distribution of those species. And we do have some, I mean, we're not starting from scratch. There is some information about how the clam reacts to different salinity regimes, but I think we can get better information in the next couple of years. And given the concerns about invasives, and given the impracticability of going out and doing some sort of, on-the-ground management of invasive species in terms of changing conditions system-wide, understanding better those kinds of relationships, the flow invasives relationships, might be something that's really, really helpful. It may affect the decisions you make about water quality standards, or more likely, it may affect the adaptive management regime for how you manage those water quality standards over time. The suggestions about physical habitat restoration are somewhat similar in the sense that one of the keystone of most management proposals to manage the estuary over the next few decades, one of the keystones has been large-scale habitat restoration. And they're based on some big assumptions that if we do large-scale habitat restoration, we're going to increase food availability. And what we need to understand is, well, if we increase food availability, what's the relationship between that food availability, that's, the productivity in a restored habitat and where the creatures are? So can we actually export productivity to the low salinity zone or to other critical habitat areas for the suite of native species that we're trying to protect under the list of fish and wildlife beneficial uses? Similarly, as conditions change during the life of the long-term adaptive management regime, how does our understanding of how climate change is going to affect hydrological regimes affect how you're going to manipulate flows to support these habitats in order to get the benefits that are hypothesized? These are really the big adaptive management questions, not the basis of whether you should do delta outflow or San Joaquin River inflow. Those aren't the key scientific questions. The questions are, what happens when you restore habitat? What happens when you change salinities and the invasives change with them? And can you get big gains there? Or conversely, do you risk big stranded assets? So we suggest you drill down on that. The final, or encourage others to do that. I think the science program is a good place to do that. The final comment that I want to make just regards adaptive management, and the first is that adaptive management, to oversimplify it a bit, I think I would say it's you establish some goals, some metrics of what it is you're trying to accomplish. You identify the stressors, the impediments to achieving those accomplishments, and say, what do you need to do to those stressors to remove the impediments? You identify the actions that you think are going to remove those stressors, and you rank them by the magnitude of the benefit and the certainty of the benefit. And then you go out and you research, you experiment, and you do implementation, you monitor, you evaluate, you come back, you change, and then you do the hokey pokey all over again. You guys need to, and you've heard this from me before, you need to be very clear about what the outcomes are that you want and to include them in the water quality standards and program of implementation if you want adaptive management to work. And I think you also need to encourage parties that are, if there's going to be a lot of effort out here to give you new information for phase 2, you should identify something similar to what I just identified, which is used in things like the logic chain that we presented to you, or the DRERIP process that the Department of Fish and Wildlife developed. There are templates for how you develop this kind of new information. that really give you higher quality information. They give you more rigorous information. To their credit, the folks that we've been working with in the San Joaquin tributaries discussion, are exploring the use of these kinds of approaches. If you really want good information, then set some expectations for the kind of process that it should go through before it comes to you. And with that, hopefully under 15 minutes, I'll, or under 10 even.
Under 10,
My God.
only
Oh, wow.
10. You might win
Thanks.
the award today. Great.
Gary, going back to, again, to David's presentation, he added an area upstream. He called it upstream, I call it passage, but whatever it is, it's above the dams. Do you see that as an area of focus that we should be, and you're dealing in both, we're talking here about phase 2, there's also phase 1. I mean, in both of them,
well,
is that
I
important?
think there is a nexus there. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is that clearly in the program of implementation, there are a number of things that should be called out and called for, and there are improvements in fish passage that I think complement the kinds of flow and water quality actions that you're likely to embrace. But beyond that, part of the existing Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan is the salmon doubling objective. And that currently calls for improvement in flow conditions in conjunction with these other measures. So I think you need to sort of consider, well, what is the state of what's going on throughout the watershed? What do we need to do? What's the appropriate contribution of flows, habitat passage, and other things to achieving that objective? So certainly getting more information about that would be useful, although I do think there is a lot in the record now to be able to establish flows pursuant to achieving the doubling objective. But again, the success of one part will be enhanced if you're doing some other things as well. So.
Thank you. Very thoughtful. Next, we have John Rubin for 5 minutes from the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, and after that, Patrick Horgans for 3 minutes, Horgans and Associates.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is John Rubin, and I am Senior Staff Counsel for the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. I do have a cold, so hopefully I can get through this and in less than 5 minutes. I will keep my comments general, given the short time that we have to present today. And given the fact that this is a quasi-legislative process, we do hope to continue discussions after today on the important issues you're facing. First, I would like to start by noting that the report that was presented to you by Dr. Bernstein, the ICF report, is currently a draft report, and we would recommend that the draft report be finalized. We see no reason, and for it to remain in draft, and for all of the reasons I think that Dr. Bernstein summarized today, there's significant benefits to having that finalized and before you in final form. Second, I did want to note that the disagreement recognized by Dr. Bernstein and ICF in the report exists at 2 levels. And Dr. Bernstein, I think, made this comment talking about science and management disagreement. I characterize it a little bit different, and it's science and policy disagreement. I think it's a key, very critical distinction that needs to be drawn here, that although there is disagreement on important scientific issues, and I don't want to understate that, there is also significant disagreement in terms of how that science is being used to develop policy. And frankly, a lot of the comments that you just heard from Mr. Bobker invoked that thought in my mind, talking about areas of scientific certainty where there's agreement amongst the scientific community. Some areas, the scientists that work for the Water Authority, I think, would disagree with him in his characterization of the science. And I think some of those that work at the policy level would disagree with the characterization of the issue as being a scientific issue and really a policy issue on whether there's agreement or disagreement amongst those that are making decisions within the water community. We do agree with the recommendation in the ICF report, as well as made to you by the Delta Science Program, that processes to better understand the basis for disagreement are critically important. The processes should lead to better understanding of the science, defining the limitations of the science, and therefore where policy decisions are needed. And these processes, I think, as also demonstrated by earlier presenters, provides a great opportunity to identify areas where new science can be developed. It's really a key part of adaptive management. And finally, as also noted earlier, the scientific issues, the policy issues that are before you are being discussed in multiple forums, and it is critically important that the State Board be aware of those other processes and coordinate with those other processes. And closing, kind of to summarize what I started with, we do hope that the State Board reserves judgment on an approach to allow the interested parties to provide an opportunity to respond to what we're hearing today. The issues are critical, and hopefully your decision will be reflective of input from all of the interested parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. Next, we have Patrick Porgens. Where's Patrick? There he is. And then after him, Becky Sheehan, State Water Contractors.
Madam Chairman and members of the board, I didn't delineate a specific amount of time, but I will be between 5 and 10 minutes.
Right. You should have asked in advance. If you can keep it shorter, that would be great.
Well, I appreciate that, Madam Chairman, but I will reflect on the following issues. The next steps, previous steps, no more delays, billions of expenditures, Bay Delta being studied to death, past decisions by the board, and the results of those. No water right adjudication there at the Bay Delta. Mismanagement and lack of enforcement. Lack of understanding of the complexities of the Delta. The lack of accountability, and the conclusions of moving forward or sidestepping the issue once again. What I did today, I'm Patrick Porgens. I'm with Porgens and Associates. I'm a de facto public trustee. I've been involved in the water issue for 40 years. I have over 100 fact-finding volumes on water alone in the West. What you're looking up there at the screen are 2 slides, and there'll be one more. That is a compendium of records and information associated with Bay Delta predominantly. There's 300 banker boxes in there, along with testimony, exhibits, reports, so forth and so on. So I have something to say, and I'll say it between 5 and 10 minutes. Thank you. So moving forward, I want to tell you I appreciate the next step, but I also want to look back at the steps we already took. And from my perspective, I have to say that the plans that have been put forth heretofore are indicative of the results that we're witnessing in the Delta as it exists today. Deplorable. And that's the first issue. The second issue is that I concur that we don't need any additional delays. That's just the reality. I mean, there's no more delays. The only thing that saved the Delta to this particular point in time is it's been raining. And when it rains, you know, we have flow. Next, I would like to talk about the issues associated with the past decisions. We've been talking about protecting this Delta since DC 1379, D 1485, the aborted D 1630, and D 1641. And we talked about how we were going to have flow criteria if an event that became obvious for salmonids. That hasn't happened. We have no testimony from what I can see from the 2 major contributors to the problem that we have experienced in the Delta since then. That's the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation. The problems in the Delta is not broken, so anybody that tells you that, that's a misnomer. What has happened there has been a series of repeated broken promises. We make these plans, we come up with these laws, and we make these decisions, but in the end, ultimately what we have is a situation where they run amok. They have not been held accountable, and unless we take into account accountability and hold these people responsible, this situation is going to continue to go on. Now, I have no aversion to having studies done. Yeah, let's study it. But let's remember that we spent an estimated $6 billion somewhere in the Delta and upstream to provide habitat and protection for fisheries. And the fish doubling program is worse than it was ever. So that tells me something. It tells me it's not working. So I asked the scientists, you know, the people that have all these PhDs, to tell me in some degree of certainty if they can quantify and qualify the impacts associated with the decline of the salmonid species, or pelagic species in particular. They don't have the answer to that question. We've been studying it for decades. Adaptive management, from the perspective of the administrative or the policy part of the component, has more to do with politics than it has to do with adapting to anything else. That's another reality. I mean, I'm only giving you this information because I'm speaking from experience. I'm not on anybody's side. And everybody here should know that. I'm here because I repeatedly brought forth information and facts prefaced solely on the record, not my opinion. And I've laid this information out to the board for 40 years. So we're talking about deaf ears here. We're talking about people that can't see beyond their position or creating an imposition that may impede their ability to continue studying the Delta to death. Let's remember that this problem we have in the Delta is a government-induced problem. We didn't have this problem before exports began in the '67 and onward. It didn't happen. And when we talk about subsidence in the Delta, we should remember we have 25 feet drop in subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley. We don't have a conjunctive surface and groundwater use program in California because the powers that be don't want it. When we had D1630 before this board, that was the ticket to really provide the protections. The governor then and the powers that be down in the valley, and we know who they are, not necessary to go into their names, they killed it. They aborted that bill. They aborted that decision at the last minute. The Bay Institute and the rest of those guys came in and went along with D1631. We opposed it. We opposed the coordinated operating agreement. We opposed the CVPIA because we knew ultimately it wouldn't work. The 800,000 acre feet of water that's purportedly for fish, they can pick that up at the back end. All that money that we spent for providing protection for fish, there's no scientific data that indicates that quantitatively it actually improved fisheries whatsoever, regardless of the rhetoric and the comments and statements that have been made by anybody. Bring me the science and show me the facts. It's not happening. So I say to you today, as one human being to another, I would like to have confidence in this board. And I see new board members up there, and congratulations for being there. You know, I hope and I pray that you do something about it. I was notified about this meeting on Good Friday. I was in Holy Week. I don't stop to get involved with these things when I'm in Holy Week. That's important to me. It may not be important to other people. And I'm told that I need to have my comments in by Tuesday noon. And this happens all the time. So what I'm saying to you is that if you're serious and you're genuine and you really have a belief and a passion in what you're doing, then you need to listen up. And you need to start understanding when people speak to you, we're speaking to you in good faith, not for any other reason. I don't make money off of this. It's cost me a fortune. And I give thanks to the board members that have dedicated their lives and their service to the public. But I'll be watching, you know, and I'll be making observations. And I'll be showing whatever this board does, along with the so-called stakeholders, that ultimately the responsibility for the demise of the Delta doesn't rest with anybody else. It doesn't rest with the Stewardship Council. It doesn't rest with BCDP. It's yours. And it's your baby, and you haven't, excuse me, your predecessors haven't done it. And I'm glad to see Mrs. Tam Dudak back on the board, because I have faith in her. At any rate, so I think that concludes my statement, and thank you for the time and your attention.
Thank you.
Have a good day. God bless you.
Next we have Becky Sheehan, and then we have Debbie Webster. Becky's for 5.
I'm hoping to be on 5. I'll talk fast.
Yeah.
My name is Becky Sheehan. I'm Senior Deputy General Counsel for Metropolitan Water District, and I'm here for the State Water Contractors. There are several takeaway messages from the workshops and the ICF report that we'd like to highlight and acknowledge. We think the first half of the ICF report, drafted by Brock Bernstein, was a very useful first step in identifying areas of uncertainty, and it posed many important questions. We'd like to highlight a couple of those. First, the report observed a need for a careful and thorough diagnosis of the areas of uncertainty and disagreement. The report recommended a process where the root causes of scientific uncertainty are specifically investigated, that you look at the competing assumptions, the use of different data sets, the different data processing procedures, etc. This is the type of analysis that Dr. Richard Hilborn proposed and offered as an example of a process that had been successful. Dr. Hilborn's example, the technical experts rolled up their sleeves, put policy and politics aside, and really looked into the sources of the technical disagreement. And by doing so, they allowed their upper managers to reach agreement, in his example, on mutually agreeable data sets, and in their case, it largely resolved the scientific controversy. My understanding of what Dr. Goodwin's group might have been proposing this morning may not be going into the same level of detail as what the report was proposing, and I hope I'm not misconstruing what was recommended. But Dr. Hilborn was suggesting a need to dig into the published literature and data and to truly understand the nature of the scientific disagreement. My understanding of Dr. Goodwin's suggestion was that the process would be dealing with issues on a significantly higher level, and we think a more comprehensive analysis would be warranted. We also hope that we'll have an opportunity to maybe comment further on the proposal, since that was put forth by the science panel, and we do have some thoughts on that as well. The second issue that we'd like to highlight from the report was actually a question, and it's how could the collaborative process be designed and managed so as not to overburden entities who are also engaged in other processes such as the BDCP. I mean, as you know, there are several ongoing processes that are grappling with the same issues, including the BDCP, and we need to have all of these processes and the state board end up a place that's both compatible and complementary. In these other forums, the agencies and stakeholder community have already taken steps to develop collaborative science processes, and it seems that those resources could be leveraged so the state board could avoid duplicative efforts and enable them to make wise use of resources. It also seems that there's a natural leadership role for the state board in collaborative science. Number 3, the report posed the question, what specific measurable ecological outcomes represent adequate protection of fishery resources? We think another way to ask this question, to phrase this question, would be what flow functions is a state board seeking to preserve, enhance, or recreate? We think it's important to understand where you're trying to go and why, and then figure out how you might get there. And in answering the flow functions, you really have to look at the natural system and figure out what the functions were historically,